Morning. How's everybody? Excellent. So my name is Ben Orenstein. I work at Thoughtbot in Boston, and this is actually the last time I'm going to be giving this talk. So you're seeing it in its most polished form. I'm excited to give it to you. I'm also excited to retire it and put it to rest and write up something new. So this is refactoring from good to great. The point of this talk is not for me to reach the end. The point of this talk is for you to learn something. So I'd like you to consider this a pairing session. I am now pairing with all of you. I'll drive, you navigate. If you get confused, please ask questions. If you have a comment, please make it. I love interaction. I'd like to talk to you. I'd like to hear from you. You're not interrupting. You're contributing. So please feel free to do that. Let's start by looking at some code. Take a second and read this guy. Okay, so this is an orders report. It takes a collection of orders, a start date and an end date, and it returns the total sales that are within that date range from those orders. Now, there are specs that are associated with this code. I run them, it looks like this. They run fast because I'm not loading Rails. You'll see me running those again and again and again, and indeed the first rule of refactoring is don't refactor code that doesn't have tests. So we have tests. All this code that I'm going to show you refactoring will have tests, and you'll see me running them continuously after I make every little change. And if I don't, you can yell at me. Now, this code looks roughly like what I would have written about a year ago. I would say today it's about a B. It's decent, but I think it can be better. There are some things that in code review I would point out and ask to be changed. Now, the first one happens on line 12. So here we have a local variable called orders within range, and we assign to it the results of doing some sort of select over the collection of orders. Now, I'm going to do a quick refactoring. There's a macro for this, so it's going to happen really fast, but don't freak out. I'm going to extract, this is a temp variable here. I'm going to extract this to query. This is a refactoring called extract temp to query. And so what happened is now I have a private method called orders within range that it was the result of that old select. So here's the before, temp variable, here's the after. Private method, same name, moved that contents down there. Now this is an established refactoring. It's called extract temp to query. And I think this is already actually a decent improvement. And there are a couple reasons why. The first is we went from one method with 2 lines to 2 methods with 1 line. I've done some funky wrapping because we don't have a lot of pixels to work with, but these really are 2 one-line methods. Now, I won't always tell you that every single time fewer lines are better in a method, but in general, that's probably true. I am deeply suspicious of methods longer than 1 line. You should be too. So, shorter methods, that's our first win. Second win, notice I've moved orders within range beneath that private keyword. For some reason, because we're programmers, when we see code, we want to read it. Here's the before. And so if I'm reading this method, the first thing I do is say, OK, here's a local. What goes in that local? And I read this code on lines 13 and 14. If I have it like this instead, I say, oh, that's a method call. It's got a decent name. I assume those are the orders that are within the range that are passed in. And I don't go down there and read that method. If I'm just trying to skim this file, I no longer need to be concerned about the details of how we get the orders within range, unless I think there's a problem there or I'm particularly interested in that functionality for some specific reason. Moreover, I've given everyone else that reads this file, including myself 6 months from now, a hint, which is orders within range calculation is not important. It's not the core functionality for this class. So that hint helps make this code more readable. So we have shorter methods, and we have more readable code. And also, we've encouraged reuse here. It's reasonable, given that we have a method called total sales within date range, that we might want something like average sales within date range, maximum sales over date range, something like this. But in every case, we're going to be calculating all the orders that happen within a date range. When the code looks like this, that functionality, or that logic for calculating, for grabbing all the orders that are within the range, is locked within this method. In this version, it's more likely that it's easier to reuse. Other methods within this class can reuse it immediately. And they don't need to be, again, don't need to be concerned with those implementation details. Questions or thoughts on this so far? Was that for me or the code? Orders within date range. You're talking about changing this name right here? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think it would be good to make them more consistent. That's a good thing. We won't do that right now, but that's a good point. Yeah?
So would you do this kind of refactoring right at the start? Or when you see a need, you will do this?
Yeah, so the question was, would I do this refactoring right away, or would I wait till I see a need? And the question is, I would do this right away. Because of those, so if the only reason I were doing this were reuse, I'm slightly less likely to do this. But because of that other advantages of readability, and that sort of hiding things beneath the private keyword, I'm very likely to do this right away. So I do this to almost all my temp variables now. I almost never have temp variables within a method. I almost always extract them out to query methods that are private, and this has made my code a lot better. Typically, so methods, the rule of methods is that they should have one job. And whenever I see a local in a method, it's a hint that it probably has two jobs, at least. It has a job of calculating what goes in that local, and then some other job to do stuff to that local. Yeah? So his concern is that if we make this method private, it makes it harder to test. So I sort of agree and I sort of don't. This code was TDD'd, and so when I pull methods into private, I'm guaranteed that functionality is still tested. I haven't changed how the code works. I've just changed the visibility of part of this thing. So because I wrote this code with TDD, I'm not concerned about losing coverage. Now, you actually touched on an interesting point, which is I used to be really fond of classes that had a tiny public interface and a fairly large private set of methods. And that felt good to me because, OK, my class, my object has a small public interface, which I'm still very fond of. But I'm coming around to this idea where if a class has too much private stuff below the surface, some people call these iceberg classes. If there's too much stuff below the private, there's a chance that there's another object yearning to be called into existence from there. Because eventually, you're testing 5, 6, 7 methods through the public interface, and your tests probably get to kind of be ugly. Like you're testing something that's farther down in this file by coming in through this method. So I've started to take this as a bit of a smell. Too many private methods, there's probably a class that wants to be born from there. Good question. Yeah?
Two issues. One is, so this is obviously a very small example. So if you had a somewhat larger example, you might, that local variable you had, you might want to use it twice.
Yes.
But if you want to use it twice, you run the query twice, and you're not caching the result of that query.
Yep.
So that's potentially a performance issue.
Yep.
Second issue is you're within a private method, you're using all the instance variables that you have.
Mm-hmm.
The order, the start date, and the end date. Now, that makes a method somewhat rigid. It's only applicable to that class. So while you can do something else within that same range, you couldn't do something else within a different date range.
Yes. Right. So I'll address those in reverse order. The first is his concern is that private method uses all 3 of our instance variables, and therefore that might make it hard to extract. Is that a fair summary? That's true, but I'm not worried about that right now. So every private method doesn't necessarily need to be extracted. However, you're going to actually see me in a minute pull out some of that functionality to address that issue that you're talking about. So I wouldn't hesitate to make something private just because I can't reuse it in other classes. That's OK for me generally. But when I have a bunch of private methods, I start to look at them and say, there's probably another generalized object that wants to be pulled out of here. Your first concern was what again?
If you need to use that twice.
Yes. So his concern was something that I get a lot from programmers, which is, well, if you use orders within range twice, you're recalculating it twice, and that's a performance concern. To which I say, you're absolutely right, and as soon as you show me performance logs that show that this is a bottleneck, I'll refactor it and make it cached. Anything else is premature optimization. Programmers love or equals. We Rubyists love like or equals. Like, well, we don't want to recalculate this, so just cache it. Caching can come back and bite you. It can do weird things occasionally in scenarios that really hurt you. So I do not do the or equals and like cache results or memoize things until I've seen some profiling, some performance data, some real numbers that say this thing is taking too much time, therefore we need to cache it. So I resist that very heavily, and I push back on that in code reviews all the time. And that drives some people crazy, but I think it's the right way to go. Yeah?
So you mentioned iceberg classes before, and then the solution was to extract all the private methods from another class.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't it actually create a very tight coupling between those two classes? Because essentially what you're creating is another class. That the whole reason for the other class is to actually be an interface to this another class.
Great question. So he's saying if I extract private methods from one class, doesn't that mean that this new class that is born is tightly coupled to this class? This class is only going to use this, the old class is using the new class, and that's it. So what's the point? Well, I'm more likely to extract any class if I think it will be reused within the system. That's a very strong push for me. So if I thought it was something that would only ever be used in this class, I might even extract a private class just to put a name around a concept and keep it private to this class and hide it beneath, encapsulate it inside that class. But if I think it's something that might get reused multiple times, I'm very happy to pull it into a new class. And I'm not really concerned about the coupling between class A needing class B, because classes need each other. They have dependencies on each other. So as long as it's not extremely specific to this class, I'm OK with class A having a dependency on class B.
Are you saying you can define a class underneath the private
Sure.
within a class?
Yeah. So class whatever, and then move the methods I want to in here. And then keep it private to this parent class. And then if it turns out that some other class wants to use it, I'll promote it to a public class, give it its own set of tests. I'll often test drive it from the start, and then have multiple classes use it. There's this concept called fan out and fan in, and I always get them confused, but I believe, so fan in means a lot of classes use you. And that's a good thing. You want high fan in, because it means you've written a component that is highly reusable, and that's great. High fan out is not so great. It means your class uses a bunch of other classes, which tends to mean it maybe is a little confused. It's trying to coordinate behavior across a whole bunch of different things, and that can often create code that's hard to understand. You need to sort of package up 5 different classes and coordinate their efforts. It's not a perfect metric, but it's worth thinking about occasionally. Yes? Her question is this Vim, and what did you use to refactor? I cheated. It's a custom macro. I'll show it to you. So it was in T. That's what it looks like. So macros in Vim are just literal recordings of exactly the keystrokes you entered to make something happen. So this is not a generalized solution. This is a one-off solution to impress people during talks. I've tried a couple different Vim refactoring plugins, hoping that someone had generalized this. Nothing out there works really well all the time. Some of them work OK some of the time. So it's worth playing with because I think there's some time to be saved there. But I haven't found anything that's really consistently great. I guess that's sort of what we pay for having dynamic typing or something along those lines.
Considering that we already have start date and end date,
Yeah.
I think it is a little bit weird that we are also passing orders to the order report. Shouldn't we kind of get it from the data stored from using the start date and end date?
Oh, shouldn't we select the order? Oh, so the question is, shouldn't we just grab the orders maybe from the database ourselves, given that we have the start date and end date? That's an interesting question. Yeah, maybe. The reason I might not do that is I like my classes to be, this is a word from Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests, which is a fantastic book. And I believe they call them context-free, something along those lines. Like this class doesn't know where orders comes from. It just knows it has a collection of something that responds to certain methods, and I like that. If I use the start date and the end date to pull something out of the database using specific class names and things like that, then this class cares about where those orders come from. I like it to not care. I like classes in general to not care about where its data came from. Also, with this way, the tests are easier to write. If I actually have it go out and hit the database, I'm going to either need to stub the the database calls or put real data in the database. And I don't like doing that. I'd rather be able to have pass stubs in, pass fake things in. It makes the tests faster, and tends to make them easier to read, and it tends to make the code better. Any more questions? One last question if we want. Otherwise, we're going to move on. Would I commit here? No, probably not. I mean, if this were the last thing I were doing with this file, yes, I would. But we're not going to right now because there's still more. There's more that can be improved, so let's improve it. What do I see? Well, check out this method orders within range. There's a little thing in here that sets off my alarm bells, and it's this and. So select takes a block, and that block has some stuff in it. And that is really just a function. It's a wrapped up bit of logic for calculating something. And I've actually gotten fairly aggressive recently about extracting things from conditionals and blocks and giving them a name for the process instead. And it tends to make my code a lot easier to read. A sign that I really, really, really need to do this is when I see and, or. Because that means that condition in there is getting a little bit complicated. And like, yes, we can read this. It's not too bad. But if we give it a name, it's going to make a lot more sense. It's going to make this file more skimmable. And so what I would like is something like ask the order, place between. This is kind of the code I wish I had. Can I do this? Let's see. No, it doesn't like that. There we go. So rather than embed the knowledge for how to see if an order is placed between a certain date range, I'd rather just ask the order. This code right here exhibits a little bit of feature envy. I'm pulling playstat out of order and comparing it to things and then making decisions. So feature envy is where one class seems really interested in the data or behavior of another class, but especially the data. So right now, this class is really interested in order's playstat and doing stuff with it. To calculating if you're placed within a range seems like a good job for order. So I'd rather ask the order if it's placed between. So I'm going to run my tests. Undefined method placed between for order, which makes sense because it's not defined yet. So let's do this. It takes a start date. Actually, no. We'll do it in baby steps. Wrong number of arguments, 2 for 0. Let's add the arguments. And now we have an error. It's not a great error because my test isn't great, but we're going to move on. We're going to figure it out now. So here's that old code. We can just ask placed at. We can just refer to start date. And I think that'll be green. Yes. So now we've moved that responsibility for answering the question, is this order placed between two dates, into order. This is generally a good rule in object-oriented programming to follow, which is put your calculations with your data. So the data for answering is an order placed between two dates. The playstat is on order. So it makes sense to push that functionality into order. However, we've now introduced a smell. A smell, by the way, is something in your code that indicates there may be a problem. It is not a problem in itself. It's an indication that a problem could exist. Sometimes fixing smells makes the overall code worse. And so sometimes I ignore code smells. But whenever I see a code smell, I at least look at it and try to make an informed decision as to whether it's worth fixing. So what's the code smell that I see? Well, it has to do with these parameters we're passing around. So up here in the initialize, we pass in a start date and an end date. And then down here in this call, we pass a start date and end date, and then we take it in this method here. So this is what's called a data clump. A data clump are parameters that you frequently see together. So when you keep seeing a pair, or 3, or 4, or 5, God forbid, parameters in a parameter list that gets passed all around, chances are, again, you have an object that wants to be born. The way you fix the data clump smell is you create a class, create an object that holds that data with it, and then pass that object. So let's do this refactoring. We're going to start by, now I want to do this refactoring in the smallest steps possible. I'd like there to be as little time as possible. So we're green right now. I'd like there to be as little time where we're red before getting back to green. So one way to do this, I'm going to create a DateRange class. And one thing I could do is feed this in from the spec and pass in DateRange in here, and then thread it through here, and then thread it through here. And the issue with that is it makes me red for a long time. My tests are broken for a long time. I'd rather my tests get back to green a little bit faster than that. So what we can do instead is create the DateRange here. And date. Now this will blow up because there's no constant called DateRange. So let's fix that. Wrong number of arguments. I'm just going to use a struct here. Now we're back to green. The code isn't actually better yet, but I've made a change and we're back to green. I know everything still works. This makes me feel good. I like these short little cycles. Okay, now that we're back to green, let's go red again, but not for too long. Let's take this DateRange and thread it through. So over here, let's pass the DateRange instead. Okay? We're going to go red because we passed one argument when that method expects two. So let's fix that. We're still going to be red, unfortunately, because we're passing in a DateRange as opposed to the start date. So we need to ask the DateRange for its start date twice. We're back to green. Now, I can actually pull out this. So we're back to green and we're using our DateRange. But now we have a couple parameters we don't need to pass, right? So let's actually go into the spec. Here's the spec. It's very simple. Here's where we grab our old start date and end date. So now let's just make a range of these. Oh. And now in here, we'll pass the DateRange. This is going to upset the orders report because it's not getting the right number of arguments. There's our DateRange. Pull these guys out. We're almost there. Oh, no, we can't. And now, rather than use the DateRange there, we'll use this DateRange. We're back to green. So I tried to do that in the way that we would stay green as often as possible in the smallest number of steps. And this helps getting things to be too broken. Sometimes it's tempting when you want to refactor something to break everything and throw all the pieces on the floor and then start picking it back up. And I've tried to discipline myself to think about what's the smallest step I can do that makes this code better and gets me back to green. Okay, what's another small step? What's another small step? And sometimes you've got to break everything. Occasionally that's just going to happen. Like, you know what? I don't see an easy way to do this, so I'm just going to make the big mess and hope I can get this back to green and then check this back in. But most of the time you can take little steps. So one second. So I want to talk about the improvement we just made here. We went from an argument list of 3 items to an argument list of 2 items. And we did that in the initialize and orders report and in this place between method here. So is this a win? Yes, I think it is a win. And the reason it's a win is because of something called parameter coupling. So coupling is the degree to which components in a system rely on each other. And there are different kinds of coupling. There are different ways things can be coupled to each other. One type of coupling is global data coupling. So if this class and this class both hit some global data, then they're coupled to each other. When things are coupled to each other, it's easy to break one by changing something in the other. So if this class suddenly pushes up a new kind of data that doesn't match what this class expects to that global data, it breaks it. It's action at a distance. You broke something far away from yourself. This makes systems hard to change. It makes them hard to understand. Typically, when a system is hard to understand, it's because of coupling. It's because of duplication. It's because when you change something over here, something breaks over here. That really makes our life harder. So let's look at a coupling example. This is an example of parameter coupling. So when the first method, notify user of failure, calls print to console, it passes in failure. Don't worry about how failure gets found. Just assume it's a local variable or a private method. Print to console then takes that failure as a parameter and then calls a method on it. So what this means is that these 2 methods are coupled to each other because notify user of failure has to build the right kind of failure. In particular, it has to build an object that responds to toSentence. And if it doesn't, it blows up. And that makes these methods not great. It makes them coupled to each other through that parameter. Notify user of failure has to know that print to console is going to call toSentence on its parameter. And we don't like components that know things about each other. You want your objects to be shy, but you also want your methods to be shy. You don't want them to know about each other. So this is coupling right here. This makes notify user of failure harder to change. So imagine if instead of just one method here, we had another method. Or not a method, but a parameter. And this thing took a bar, and then it called bar.baz. Now you can see notify user of failure has to know even more about print to console. It has to know that its bar argument is going to have the method baz called on it, and it has to build the right kind of bar. So if you're familiar with induction, we can start to see that the more parameters you have, the more opportunities there are for parameter coupling, and the more opportunities you have to get your code sort of complected together. So it follows that an argument list with 2 arguments is better than an argument list with 3. Argument list of 1 is better than 2, and no arguments is best of all. And when do you get no arguments? You get no arguments in object-oriented programming when you have instance data, when you have local methods that operate on instance data. So let's come back to our code over here. I argue that we have improved things. Our coupling has reduced. The degree to which things rely on each other in the system has gone down, because now we only pass two things into the orders report and 2 things on into this method. Any questions about this or comments? Had a hunch.
The place between, when you do that, you can actually stop exposing the place that. Because you could have done place that.
Yes, the question is, now that we have this place between, can we stop exposing place.dat? Yeah, absolutely. And that's a big win for having that method there, actually. I'd rather not. So I'm using an Openstruct here, so anything can call it. It's part of the public interface. This is just sort of a shortcut to get the code written. But yes, absolutely. Now that we have this method, we don't have to let that place.dat data leak out of order. And that's definitely a good thing. Yeah.
2 things. In the order report, can we assume that any orders outside of the range are irrelevant to the class?
Sure.
So in that case, maybe we can define orders in the initialize method and do away with the DateRange.
Pass in just the orders.
Yeah.
Yeah, so his comment is we can probably, if the orders report is only concerned with orders within a particular range, maybe we just pass in those orders. We pre-select them outside. Right?
I didn't mean that. I meant define orders in the initialize the scope, so you can do away with that private method there.
Oh, you're saying in here, find the orders, the right orders, and do away with the private method? I think that would be worse. Like, I like that I see the calculation for finding orders within range as a separate thing. I actually don't like to do almost any work in initialize. I like my initializes to be really dumb and simple, because that's the first thing you got to read when you look at a class. You say, what's this thing got for instance data? And so I don't want to have to okay, it's got, oh God, here we go. Okay, and that calls so that tends to make it harder to sort of skim the class.
Sorry. The other thought was that order report class knows that order has an amount. Maybe that should be moved to the order class.
Yes, that's a fair point. So he's saying that the orders report knows that orders have an amount. That's also a good point. Yeah, that'd be a great thing to pull out. Yeah, agreed. Yep. We won't do that right now, but I think that's a good point. Other stuff. Lots, yes.
Why use a DateRange class when you can just use a range object?
That's a good question. He says, why use a DateRange class when you can use a range object? And we're going to do that. You're totally correct.
How would you have adjusted your behavior if your tests weren't as fast as they are?
How would I adjust this behavior if my tests weren't as fast as they are? I'd suck it up and just run the tests. So when I'm working on Rails apps, I use something called Zeus, which I have a love-hate relationship with. It mostly works really, really well and runs your tests really fast. It basically starts up your Rails, starts up a Rails process and then forks it off whenever you need to run tests. So you just pay very little penalty in the time to the first test. It's pretty handy. And there's a bunch of other. So I actually have a mailing list about fast Rails tests. It's fastrailstest.com if you want to sign up. And I write stuff about how to speed up your Rails tests if you're curious. But I agree it's a real pain. I love how fast these tests are. I hate how slow they are in Rails, so I'm always trying to make them faster. But I would still run the tests. It slows me down. It's not as fun. It hurts me getting in the zone, but you run the tests. That's just how you do it. Sometimes I'll sneak a couple steps in together. Like you saw me run the tests when I define the method and get the wrong number of parameters, and then write the number of parameters. And sometimes I'll do that both at the same time because it's going to be okay. Yeah?
One of the things you kind of lost through it in there is place between. Reading that, I'm left wondering, is that inclusive of the end dates? Is it exclusive of the end dates?
Yeah.
First version, that was obvious from the first line of results from DateRange. Now I've kind of got to dig down a couple of things to figure that out.
That's fair feedback.
Any thoughts on how to address that?
So he's saying that my name isn't great, is basically the gist of that. Place between doesn't make it clear if it includes the end dates or not. I would probably toy with different things. Place between non-inclusive, something like that. I would play with some names like that. I'm not shy about putting long names on things if it makes it really obvious. I guess the question would be, how often am I concerned with that sort of particular bit? If that's something that's really important to this report and one of the things I'm going to want to open it up and figure out often, it's much more likely that I'm going to put a big old name on there that makes it really obvious. But that's fair feedback on that. Yeah.
Now you've moved quite a bit of code out into other methods.
Yeah.
The tests are no longer unit tests, they're integration tests. Is it something that you go through?
Yeah, isn't that a pain? He's saying that now that I've moved code out into other classes, my tests are no longer unit tests, they're integration tests. They're testing orders report, which then goes out to order. So I'm testing through there. Yeah, that's a drag. What I do when I'm doing this kind of stuff is go back and fix the tests. I think it's important to keep unit tests. It's important to keep them testing only one thing, only one class, generally. So usually at this point I would go back and say, okay, well we did pull this out into a new class. And what I'll often do is like, okay, I see that I want to pull out this place between method into order. So rather than just pull the data out from the orders report or the method out from orders report and then put it into order, I'll first write a test for order for the place between method, then move that code, then go back and fix the orders report code to make sure it doesn't use that. So it's a bit of a pain, but it's worth keeping the tests clean for that. Yeah?
Is this logic not the wrong way around? Surely DateRange should know how to find some things within its
God, what a perfect segue. So he says, isn't this logic the wrong way round? So shouldn't it, this knowing how to calculate if something is within a date range, live on DateRange? And absolutely it should. So let's do that. We have here, so one of the benefits of our DateRange class is we've created something that Corey Haynes calls a behavior magnet, which I think is a good name. So right now, DateRange is dumb. It's just a struct. It just has some data. It's actually a value object. But we can put a little bit of calculation on that value object. So a great thing to move there is this calculation. It's extremely likely that now that we have this idea of a range, that we're going to have other things that have ranges that we're going to want to ask if something happened in between it. Are the orders placed within a range? Was this coupon redeemed within a range? Did this user sign up within a range? So this kind of behavior is perfect to move out into a generalized class. So what would that look like? Well, we'd ask DateRange, do you include my playstat? Oops. Something like that. Again, I have my not so good error due to these structs being a little bit weird. Struct actually defines include because it mixes in enumerable. But don't worry about that. Let's grab this stuff. We're going to throw it in here. And then I'm refactoring in the red a little bit here. You see I'm taking bigger steps. This is not so good. I get a little naughty every once in a while. Date. Oops. And then we don't need to reference that. And then date. And then we don't need to reference that. Back to green. Not too bad. So yeah, totally perfect place to hold that behavior. Behavior magnets. Awesome. This is now a value object. This is something I'm becoming very fond of now. It's not quite immutable. Imagine it's immutable, and it is a value object. We set the start date and the end date when we build it, and then we can't change them later. And the only thing that shows up on this class are methods that use that data and return answers. There's no behavior. That's a value object. And value objects are actually great for making your system easier to reason about. People that have done any functional program with immutable data structures, particularly like Clojure, that's a great language to look at, by the way, for Ruby. It's some really interesting ideas in there. Value object is a bit of an idea from, it brings some of the ideas from functional programming into the object-oriented world, and it brings the really good ideas, immutable data and simple calculations based on data. So I actually have been using more and more value objects in my code, and I really like that. Data clumps are great to turn into value objects. It's an awesome refactoring. OK, so now someone had asked if we can just make this a range. And we can. Can we just do this? How crazy can we be? Bam. Yeah. OK. So DateRange is now just a range. I'm using inheritance, which I feel a little bad about, but that's all right. So is this DateRange worth defining if it's just a range? Maybe. Kind of. I think it's a little clearer. A range is really, a range that you give two dates is a date range. So why don't we just give it that name? I think in general, names in systems tend to make things easier to understand. When there's an implicit idea like, hey, a start date plus an end date is a date range, and you can give an explicit name to that concept, tends to make the system easier to understand. Of course, like all things in programming, there's another side to that, which is too many words, too much vocabulary within a system can make it harder to understand. So you got to figure out where your balance is. There's always pros and cons in all these things. In every refactoring I'm doing, there's a negative side. That's always true. There's nothing that you're like, this is always awesome. The only thing that I think is maybe close to that is duplication. I think it's pretty much always better to remove duplication. It's hard for me to think of an example where it would be worse. But pretty much everything else is like trade-offs. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. Depends what your goals are. A couple more things I would do just to clean up this class real fast before we move on would be, remember I talked about how I like to pull out things that have sort of semi-complicated block contents, like that select? Well, we kind of got the same thing going on in this inject. What am I really doing here? I'm grabbing the orders within range, and then I get the amounts, and then I sum the amounts. So there's a better name for this process. This is an implicitly you can read all this code and figure out what I'm going to do, or I can give it a good name, and then you can ignore this code unless you care about it. So that's kind of what I'd like it to look like. This is going to give me probably a bogus error. Undefined method total sales. Really? Awesome. You guys asked a lot of good questions. Orders. Orders. OK. This is basically how I like my public interfaces to look. Total sales within date range is the total sales of orders within range. Reads well, looks good, makes sense. Really high level. All the low-level details have been pushed below that private keyword. You can dig into them if you're concerned, if you need to fix something, if you think you found a bug. But if you're just trying to figure out this class, what's in the orders report? Well, it takes orders. It takes a date range. Then it gets the total sales of the orders within range. That's beautiful. This is how I like my code to look. OK, we're low on time, so I'm going to skip questions for now. We're going to move on. We're also going to go a little long, but don't tell these guys. OK, so I'm running a new spec now for my new code. Take a look at this new bit of code. Scroll down for you. All right. A job site represents somewhere we're doing like some construction work, for example. All job sites have locations because you got to do the work somewhere. Job sites may or may not have a contact. Sometimes we don't know who we should contact for a particular job site. Because of this fact, we don't always know if there's a contact. We have a lot of checks for here. We say, if there's a contact, get their name. If there's a contact, get their phone. Otherwise, we provide some defaults. And if we want to email them, but only if they actually exist. So the problem with this code is that we've co-opted nil. Avdi Grimm calls this co-opting nil, which I think is a great way of putting this. So we've decided that when there's no contact, because of the way Ruby works, at contact gets the value of nil. We're using nil to stand in to mean no contact. And because of that fact, I need to check for contacts truthiness every time I want to use it. I can't just send it a message. Co-opting nil is not a great idea. Nil is for particular purposes. This is not a good use of nil. It obscures the true intent of the code. This method is uglier and more confusing than it needs to be. These conditionals don't really need to be here. They're here because of an annoying incidental complexity, which is if you don't set a value to an instance variable in Ruby, it gets set as nil. I would like to change that. What I want to do instead is just always call contact.name. I'd rather create an object that means there is not a contact and have that be set in at contact as opposed to nil, and have that object be able to answer questions and respond to method calls. Anybody have an idea of what that pattern is called? Null object. So this is introduce null object is the name of this refactoring. By the way, if you haven't read Refactoring by Martin Fowler, is that who the author is? What's that? Martin Fowler, yeah. Refactoring by Martin Fowler is a must-read, period. Introduce null object. So let's create an object that stands in for when we have no contact. Now, one way to do this is to like this. When we don't have a contact, set a null contact. The problem with this is it breaks every method. It breaks 3 methods at once. So I do have tests in here to make sure that when there's no contact, that name, phone, and email all do the right thing. The problem with this is this breaks a bunch of stuff. I got 3 errors. I don't want 3 errors. I talked about refactoring in small steps. This is an instance of that. So what I'm going to do instead here, I'm going to do this. I'm going to replace it in just one method. And then call name on it. This blows up because the constant is not defined, which is a wholly reasonable. It's going to blow up because name is not defined. And then it's going to blow up because the return value is wrong. It should be no name. Back to green. Short refactoring cycle. All the other code is still there, but everything's still green. As opposed to 3 broken tests, I had 1 broken test with easy to follow errors every time, and now I'm back to green. This is a sign of a good refactoring. Null contact.new.phone. 1 error. It's the right error. I'm going to do 2 steps at once here. Back to green. And then one more place we have to do this, else. Whoops, parse error. Got the right error, so I'll just add that. And when we have this method, we don't need to do anything. We just do nothing. Cool. Back to green. Now that we have this null contact in here, I can assign it up here instead. Are we still green? We are. And now we get to do every programmer's favorite thing, which is what? Delete code. We're still green. So by making a tiny, stupid, simple value object, effectively, with this null contact, we can now yank out a whole bunch of lines of crap. A whole bunch of lines of conditionals that are just there to deal with incidental complexity, which is not important to our application. We now also don't have feature envy. Before, we're asking contact, hey, do you exist? If so, what's your name? And if not, I have a solution for you. That's feature envy. This class is really concerned with contact. It's like, get out of contact's business. You send contact the contact.name message, and then you go take a nap. That's what I want this class to do. We're not co-opting nil anymore. We've created a concept to stand in for meaning there's no contact there. How many people have code, especially in their controllers and their Rails app, that reads something like, if current user, yana, yana, yana. Yeah, and anyone with their hands up, down is lying, by the way. Null user is a magical refactoring for that kind of thing. Rather than having current user return a user object, or nil, have it return a user, or a null user, and you will be amazed at how many conditionals you can blow away. It makes the code read so much better. It's great. Now the downside of this refactoring, of course, is a downside. We now have something like a parallel hierarchy that we have to deal with. So now, if we add a new method onto contact, this is what somebody always asks, do we now need to add a new method to null contact? Probably. That's a bummer. But you know what? It's often worth it. But it's not always worth it. So look and see how many conditionals you have. If you're constantly checking for the presence of something and using nil instead, then it's probably worth the added pain of needing to remember to put something on null contact later. Probably a good refactoring to do. Questions on this? Yeah?
Why don't we just make a contact class like defaults, for example?
Yes, why don't I just use a contact class with defaults? Because then the contact class stands for 2 things. It stands for real contacts and not actually having a contact. It would probably make the contact class a little confusing. I like my classes to have extremely simple jobs, one single job. So if I say this class stands in for a real contact and also no contacts, and also, that and also means you probably want a separate class there. He's saying you can technically have subclasses. Sure, that's another way to do this sort of thing. I generally don't reach for inheritance as my first line of defense. I prefer composition, but yes, you could use some classes for that. Yeah?
In this case, the job site might want to return no name when the contact is null, but another class might want to return something else, like
Yes.
so how do we
So he's saying that sometimes other classes might want different default values for the null contact, and that's a perfect responsibility for null contact to not worry about. So I might define new methods on null contact. So we're low on time, so I'm going to wrap up with a couple things. Just a few quick things. When do you refactor? I've shown some good refactorings, but when do you do them? Here's when I refactor, and then we're out of here. One is after every change you make. Cool. Every time I go from red to green, I look back and say, can I refactor this? When I check in, I do a git diff of my changes and say, did I introduce any smells? Do I need to refactor this? If you do it continuously, you never have to do those giant refactorings that suck and take weeks and really throw off your schedule. So I do it all the time after every change I make. The next is when I have God objects. What do God objects look like? Well, here's what God objects look like. Rails apps typically have two God objects. One is the thing that app is about. So in a to-do application, it's to-do. In an e-commerce application, it's order. The other is what? User. Exactly. Here's an app I worked on recently. This is the line count of each of its models. This is an e-commerce app. Surprise. Not all these sins in here were mine, but it's a good example. Finally, two more places I especially look for refactorings. One is in high churn files. It's not really worth refactoring a class that works already and no one ever looks at. That code's written, it works, who cares? Yes, it could be better, it doesn't matter. But if a class gets changed a lot, it's especially worth refactoring to make it easier to support those new kind of changes. A good way to detect classes like that, it was with this gem called churn, which goes through your Git history, and it looks at how often things get changed. And then finally, the best place to look for things is when refactoring is when you have bugs. And the reason is bugs love company. If there's a bug right here, there's probably a bug right here-ish. The reason you have a bug is because the class wasn't clear enough to understand the first time. So chances are you need to refactor it to make it easier to understand, and then you'll probably have additional bugs fall out of that. So we have to wrap up, but I love talking about this stuff, so please come up and chat and say hi, and we can talk about this all day long. Thank you very much.